Welcome back to the channel, where ordinary stories often turn out to be not so ordinary. Tonight, we are traveling back in time to the year 1912, to a quiet little town in Iowa called Villisca. At first glance, Villisca seemed like the perfect picture of early 20th century American life. Families knew each other, children played freely in the streets, and doors were often left unlocked. But one summer night would forever change the way people remembered this peaceful community. What happened inside a small white house at the edge of town has puzzled investigators, horrified neighbors, and captured the imagination of generations for more than a century. On the evening of June 9, 1912, the Moore family returned home after a busy day. Josiah and Sarah Moore, along with their 4 young children, had attended church events and then welcomed 2 friends of their daughter to spend the night. It was an ordinary Sunday evening, full of the kinds of small routines that make up family life: putting children to bed, closing the doors, and settling in for the night. No one in Villisca could have imagined that this would be the last time the Moore household would ever be seen alive together. By the following morning, when the family failed to appear for daily activities, concerned neighbors grew uneasy. What they found inside the Moore residence shocked not only Villisca but also the entire nation. 8 people had lost their lives in the middle of the night, all within the safety of their own home. The tool used in the crime was not brought by a stranger from outside, but was instead an everyday household item, a simple axe that belonged to the family itself. That unsettling detail only deepened the mystery and fear that quickly spread through town. The sheer scale of the tragedy was unlike anything people in rural Iowa had ever seen. It was not just the loss of one person. It was the sudden disappearance of an entire family, along with 2 visiting children who had innocently stayed the night. This was not the kind of event that fit into the normal narrative of small-town America, where life was supposed to be safe, predictable, and rooted in community values. Instead, it was a moment that shattered illusions of security and left lasting scars on everyone who lived there. News of the Villisca murders spread quickly across the United States. Newspapers called it one of the darkest crimes in Iowa history, and the story appeared on front pages far beyond the Midwest. Reporters arrived, theories multiplied, and suspicion cast shadows on friends, relatives, and even strangers passing through town. For Villisca, the story was no longer local. It had become a national sensation, the subject of endless speculation. And yet, for all the headlines, interviews, and rumors, one haunting truth remained: no one could explain exactly what happened inside that house or why. More than 100 years later, the Villisca Axe murders are still remembered not just as an unsolved mystery, but as a story of innocence lost and questions that remain unanswered. In order to truly understand the weight of this tragedy, we need to pause and look at the people whose lives were cut short that night. Behind every headline and every whispered theory were real individuals: parents, children, and friends whose ordinary lives were suddenly stopped in the most extraordinary and devastating way. Remembering who they were brings us closer to the human side of this mystery, beyond the shadow of the unknown figure who carried out the act. At the heart of the household was Josiah Moore, often called Joe by his neighbors. He was a respected businessman in Villisca, running a successful farm equipment store in town. Those who knew him described him as hard-working, dependable, and deeply devoted to his family. His wife, Sarah, was equally admired. She was active in the local church, cared deeply about her children, and often organized Sunday school events. On that very day in June, Sarah had hosted a Children's Day program at their church, a joyful event filled with music, recitations, and laughter. It was a moment of pride for her, a reflection of how much she valued community and family. Together, Josiah and Sarah were raising 4 young children. Herman, the oldest at 11, was already showing signs of responsibility, often helping his father with small tasks and looking after his younger siblings. Catherine, just 10 years old, was thoughtful and kind, with a natural curiosity about the world. Boyd, age 7, was the energetic one, always full of questions and eager to explore. And then there was Paul, only 5, the youngest in the family, remembered as cheerful and playful. For the people of Villisca, these children were familiar faces, kids who played in the streets, attended school, and were loved by everyone who knew them. That evening, the Moore children had invited 2 friends to stay the night, Lena and Ina Stillinger. The Stillinger sisters were excited to spend time with their friends after the church program. At just 12 and 8 years old, they were looking forward to a simple sleepover, the kind that children cherish. Their decision to accept the invitation would place them in the wrong place at the wrong time, tying their names forever to one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Altogether, 8 lives were intertwined that night in the Moore home. What made the story so devastating for Villisca was not only the sudden loss of an entire household, but also the way it cut across generations, parents, children, and friends. Each represented a different part of the town's social fabric. Losing them all at once left a hole that could never truly be filled. For the Moore and Stillinger families, the grief was unimaginable. For the community, the shock was overwhelming. This was not a tragedy that could be quietly buried and forgotten. It was an event that demanded answers, yet no answer seemed to come. The faces of Josiah, Sarah, their children, and the Stillinger sisters became symbols of innocence lost, their memory casting a long shadow over Villisca. And it is because of them, not only because of the mystery, that the story of the Villisca Axe murders continues to echo more than a century later. Their lives remind us that behind every unsolved crime are real human beings whose stories deserve to be told. When neighbors first noticed that the Moore family had not been seen on the morning of June 10, a sense of unease began to spread. In small towns like Villisca, daily routines were predictable, and when those patterns broke, people noticed. By late morning, concerned friends and relatives approached the Moore home. What they discovered inside would leave scars on the community that time could never erase. The house itself, a modest 2-story structure with white siding, was the kind of home you would expect to find in rural Iowa during the early 1900s. It was not grand, but it was filled with the everyday details of family life: schoolbooks, toys, and the quiet comfort of routine. Stepping into that house on June 10th, however, was like stepping into a scene that defied explanation. Investigators and townspeople who entered described an atmosphere that felt disturbed, unnatural, almost ritualistic. Curtains had been drawn tightly, shutting out the summer light. Even more unsettling, mirrors throughout the home had been covered with cloth or pieces of clothing, as though someone did not want reflections to reveal what had taken place. These small but deliberate actions suggested a chilling attention to detail on the part of the intruder. Near the kitchen, a strange discovery deepened the mystery: a slab of bacon, wrapped in cloth, was left on the table beside a key piece of evidence, the family's own axe. Why would someone commit such an act and then leave behind something so odd, so out of place? To many, this detail hinted at either ritual, symbolism, or perhaps the disordered mind of the person responsible. The upstairs bedrooms told the same story of deliberate violence carried out with eerie silence. The Moore parents and children were found in their beds, as though they had been attacked while in the comfort of sleep. Downstairs, the Stillinger sisters were discovered in the guest room. What was most disturbing to townspeople was the thought that the killer had moved carefully through the house, room by room, extinguishing every source of life without waking the neighbors or raising an alarm. Another disturbing detail emerged: all the doors had been locked from the inside. This meant that whoever committed the crime must have secured the house before leaving, either by using a hidden key or slipping out through an unlocked window. For investigators, it raised unsettling questions: had the killer known the family well enough to move comfortably through their home? Or was it the work of a stranger who had meticulously studied their routines? Perhaps most unsettling of all was the eerie calm that seemed to linger after the crime. There were no signs of hurried escape. No valuables were stolen. Nothing suggested robbery or revenge. It was as though the intruder's only purpose was to carry out the act itself. That lack of clear motive haunted investigators then. And it continues to trouble researchers today. The crime scene left behind a puzzle with missing pieces. Each small clue, the covered mirrors, the locked doors, the bacon on the table, was unsettling, but none of them came together into a picture that explained why. Instead, they served only to deepen the sense of fear and confusion. For the people of Villisca, it was the beginning of years of suspicion, rumors, and doubt. Among the many details of the Villisca case, one stands out as both ordinary and deeply unsettling: the weapon. The tool that ended 8 lives that night was not something exotic, not a gun smuggled in from outside, nor a rare blade chosen with precision. Instead, it was an everyday household item: the Moore family's own axe, normally kept in a shed, used for simple chores like chopping wood. That detail alone was chilling to the people of Villisca. It meant the intruder had not come armed. Whoever entered the Moore home chose to use what was already there, transforming a familiar tool of daily life into an instrument of tragedy. The axe itself was found inside the house, leaning against a wall. Its wooden handle and metal blade bore silent witness to what had happened in the dark hours of the night. For investigators, it became one of the most important pieces of evidence, but at the same time, one of the most confusing. If the killer had planned this in advance, why not bring their own weapon? If it was a crime of opportunity, how had they known where to find the axe and how to move through the house without waking anyone? This choice of weapon left investigators torn between two possibilities. On one hand, it could have been the mark of a stranger, a drifter passing through town, unarmed, who stumbled upon the opportunity and acted with sudden violence. On the other hand, it could suggest someone familiar with the Moore household, someone who knew where things were kept, and who felt comfortable enough inside the house to move freely. Both theories raised unsettling questions, and neither brought comfort to the community. In the years that followed, the axe became more than just a tool of violence. It became a symbol of the mystery itself. Reporters of the time often highlighted it in their articles, using it to capture the imagination of readers across the country. The image of an ordinary family weapon turned against its owners resonated with the public. It blurred the line between safety and danger, between the ordinary and the unimaginable. For the Moore family, the symbolism was even more painful. The axe had been a part of their daily lives, a symbol of work, home, and survival in rural Iowa. After that night, it became forever linked with loss. For the town, it represented the intrusion of horror into the most familiar corners of life. This was not a crime that happened in a dark alley or on a distant battlefield. It happened inside a family home, with tools of ordinary living. Even today, the axe remains one of the enduring elements of the Villisca story. Paranormal investigators and tourists who visit the house often talk about the sense of unease tied to that detail. It is not simply the violence itself, but the way in which something so normal could become so terrifying. The choice of weapon reminds us that sometimes the greatest fears are not born from the strange or the foreign, but from the things we thought we understood and trusted most. The presence of the axe forces us to ask, was this crime carefully planned, or was it spontaneous? Was the weapon chosen deliberately, or was it simply what was available? More than a century later, those questions remain unanswered, echoing like the sound of a blade against wood, familiar, ordinary, and yet forever unsettling. When the horrifying discovery inside the Moore home was made on the morning of June 10, 1912, the first instinct of neighbors was to call the local authorities. But what followed was not the orderly, methodical investigation one might expect today. Instead, the Villisca case quickly became an example of how small-town resources, limited experience, and overwhelming public curiosity could derail the search for justice. The sheriff of Montgomery County at the time had never encountered anything of this scale. Villisca was a quiet farming community, not a place where mass murder investigations were part of daily life. When news spread that something terrible had happened in the Moore home, townspeople rushed to the scene. Before officers could secure the house, dozens of curious neighbors, reporters, and even children wandered through the rooms. Some people touched objects, others moved items, and many simply stared in disbelief at what they saw. This uncontrolled access to the crime scene destroyed valuable evidence before it could be properly examined. The Moore home, instead of being treated as a sealed site of forensic importance, became almost a grim spectacle. By the end of that day, it was said that nearly 100 people had stepped inside. One man reportedly even took a small piece of Josiah Moore's skull as a morbid keepsake. These shocking breaches of evidence collection meant that investigators could never fully trust the integrity of the clues they later examined. Despite the chaos, law enforcement tried to piece together what they could. They studied the axe, the covered mirrors, the locked doors. They interviewed neighbors who had seen the family the night before. But almost immediately, the case was clouded by rumors, speculation, and gossip. In a town where everyone knew each other, suspicion spread quickly. Some pointed to business rivalries. Others whispered about jealousies, grudges, or strangers seen passing through the train station. Without modern forensic tools like DNA analysis or reliable fingerprinting, detectives had to rely on witness accounts and circumstantial evidence. Unfortunately, these accounts often contradicted one another. Some residents swore they had seen unfamiliar figures lurking near the Moore home that night. Others insisted no one unusual was around. Theories multiplied, but none could be confirmed. Adding to the challenge was the pressure from newspapers. Reporters from across Iowa and soon from across the country descended on Villisca. They demanded updates, printed speculation, and fueled sensational headlines. While this brought national attention to the case, it also added enormous pressure to local officials, who were unprepared for the spotlight. Every mistake, every inconsistency, was magnified. The early investigation revealed a painful truth: Villisca's officials were out of their depth. They were dealing with a crime that shocked even seasoned detectives from larger cities, yet here it fell to a small-town sheriff and a handful of deputies with no specialized training. The initial hours after the discovery so critical in solving any crime had been lost to chaos, curiosity, and confusion. That failure would haunt the case forever. From that moment on, every lead, every suspect, and every theory carried the shadow of a contaminated crime scene. Investigators could never be sure whether the details they studied were genuine clues left by the killer, or simply traces left behind by the dozens of townspeople who had wandered through in morbid fascination. It was a beginning filled with mistakes, and those mistakes would shape the frustrating, inconclusive investigation that followed. As the weeks passed after the Villisca tragedy, investigators faced an impossible challenge: narrowing down who could have committed such a shocking crime. With no clear evidence and a contaminated crime scene, they turned to motives, rumors, and circumstantial connections. Out of this confusion, several main suspects emerged, each with their own dark shadows and puzzling inconsistencies. The first and most infamous suspect was Reverend George Kelly. He was a traveling preacher, described by many as eccentric, restless, and odd in his behavior. Kelly had been in Villisca the very night of the murders, attending the same Children's Day program at the church that the Moore family attended. Witnesses recalled that he seemed nervous and overly interested in the Moore family's movements. Later, Kelly boarded a train early the next morning, reportedly speaking about the murders before news had even spread widely. This suspicious detail caught investigators' attention. Kelly's behavior grew stranger as the case unfolded. He wrote bizarre letters to police and to investigators, inserting himself into the story. At one point, he even confessed to the crime, describing details that sounded convincing. But just as quickly, he retracted his statement, claiming he had been pressured or confused. His confession raised more questions than it answered. Was he truly guilty, or was he simply a troubled man who craved attention? In later trials, his credibility collapsed, and despite 2 attempts in court, he was never convicted. To some, Kelly remained the likeliest suspect. To others, he was nothing more than a scapegoat. Another prominent suspect was Frank Jones, a wealthy businessman and Iowa state senator. Jones had once employed Josiah Moore, but the relationship ended badly. Rumors swirled that Moore had left Jones's company to start his own competing business, taking customers with him. Even more scandalous were whispers that Moore may have had an inappropriate relationship with Jones's daughter-in-law, adding a possible personal motive. Did Jones hire someone to settle the score? While there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime, his social standing and political power made some wonder whether he could have arranged for others to carry it out. Beyond these two, investigators also looked at transient workers, drifters, and other outsiders passing through the area. The proximity of railroad lines meant that strangers often came and went in Villisca. Some locals claimed to have seen suspicious figures near the Moore home on the night of the murders. In an era when fears of wandering criminals were high, the idea of a drifter committing the crime fit neatly into the public imagination. But again, no concrete evidence ever surfaced. The problem for investigators was that each suspect came with both plausible motives and serious doubts. Kelly's confession seemed forced and unreliable. Jones had motive but no physical connection to the scene. The idea of a drifter explained the mystery of the weapon and the escape, but no specific individual was ever identified or captured. As the months turned into years, suspicion hung heavy in the air. In Villisca, people quietly took sides. Some believed Kelly was guilty, others whispered about Jones's involvement, while still others feared a nameless stranger had passed through town, leaving terror in his wake. For the families of the victims, none of these theories brought comfort. Instead, each passing year made it clear that certainty might never come. The list of suspects gave the case endless layers of intrigue. Yet without evidence strong enough to secure a conviction, every suspect remained a ghost of possibility present in the story, but never proven. And so, the mystery deepened. As the years passed after the Villisca Axe murders, the hunger for justice only grew stronger. The town of Villisca lived under a shadow of suspicion, rumors, and fear. Families wanted closure, newspapers demanded answers, and law enforcement felt the weight of a nation watching. The pressure to put someone on trial became overwhelming. And yet, when the case finally reached the courtroom, it revealed just how fragile the evidence truly was. The central figure in these trials was Reverend George Kelly. His odd behavior, unsettling confessions, and presence in Villisca on the night of the murders made him the most obvious target for prosecutors. In 1917, 5 years after the crime, Kelly was arrested and charged. His trial quickly became a spectacle. Reporters filled the courtroom, eager to capture every word of testimony. The prosecution leaned heavily on his written confession, in which Kelly had claimed responsibility for the crime. But that confession quickly unraveled under scrutiny. Kelly later recanted, saying that police had pressured him into signing it. His defense attorneys painted him as a man of fragile mental health, easily manipulated, and desperate for attention. Witnesses testified to his strange mannerisms, but strangeness alone was not enough to prove guilt. The first trial ended in a hung jury, with jurors unable to agree on a verdict. The second trial, held later that year, resulted in a full acquittal. George Kelly walked free, and though suspicion lingered, the law had spoken. For many, this outcome was devastating years of waiting, only to be left with more uncertainty. Other suspects were whispered about in courtrooms and in newspapers, but none ever faced serious legal consequences. Theories involving Frank Jones, the businessman and state senator, were never pursued in trial, likely due to lack of evidence and his powerful position in society. For the drifters and outsiders occasionally accused, there was never enough proof to move beyond speculation. What became clear in the courtroom was what investigators had feared from the very beginning: the case was too damaged. The crime scene had been compromised by curious townspeople. The forensic tools of the time were primitive compared to what we have today. Fingerprinting was unreliable, blood analysis was in its infancy, and DNA science was decades away. Without strong physical evidence, the prosecution's arguments relied on confessions, circumstantial suspicions, and community gossip, none of which could stand up to the strict demands of a jury. For the families of the victims, the trials brought not closure, but heartbreak. The hope that justice would be served dissolved in the reality that no one would be held accountable. The Moore and Stillinger families were left with only grief, and the community of Villisca was left with unease. If a crime so horrific could go unpunished, what did that mean for the safety of everyone else? By the end of the trials, the Villisca case had slipped firmly into the category of unsolved. It was no longer just a local tragedy, it had become a cautionary tale about the limits of justice in the early 20th century. The acquittals showed that without strong evidence, even the most sensational crime could fade into legal limbo. And so, while the courtroom doors eventually closed, the mystery remained wide open. By the time the last trial ended in 1917, the Villisca Axe murders had already transformed from a local tragedy into something much larger, a story whispered in homes across America, a mystery that seemed destined never to be solved. For the people of Villisca, the sense of unease never faded. They still had to walk past the Moore house on quiet streets. They still saw reminders of the 8 lives lost. And worst of all, they still had no answer to the question that haunted them most: who could have done this? With no convictions and no clear evidence, the case officially slipped into the realm of the unsolved. In law enforcement terms, it became what is known today as a cold case, a file that remains open, but without active leads to pursue. At the time, the concept of cold cases was not as formalized as it is now. But the reality was the same. The Villisca murder simply had nowhere else to go. Over the decades, the story refused to fade away. Newspapers continued to revisit it, especially on anniversaries. Every few years, a new theory would appear. Some pointed again to Reverend George Kelly, believing his acquittal had been a miscarriage of justice. Others looked toward Frank Jones, convinced that money and power had shielded him from prosecution. Still others suggested that the killer had been a passing drifter, long gone before anyone thought to question him. Each theory kept the mystery alive, but none offered definitive proof. The unsolved nature of the case gave it a kind of mythic quality. In small towns across America, people told and retold the story of the Moore family, often adding dramatic flourishes. For many, it became not only a tragedy but also a warning that evil could strike even in the safest of places, and that justice was not always guaranteed. As time passed, the case took on new layers of meaning. For historians, it became an example of the limitations of early 20th century criminal investigations. For writers, it was a source of endless speculation. For Villisca itself, it was both a burden and a strange kind of notoriety. The town could never escape being defined by what had happened in 1912. Even today, more than a century later, the Villisca Axe murders remain a fixture in lists of America's greatest unsolved crimes. Books, documentaries, and podcasts revisit the details again and again, each searching for a fresh angle, a clue that may have been overlooked. But despite all the retellings, the conclusion is always the same: there is no definitive answer. That uncertainty is part of why the case continues to fascinate. Unlike solved crimes, where answers eventually bring closure, an unsolved case lingers in the imagination. It invites people to wonder, to speculate, and to create their own theories. The lack of resolution is what keeps the story alive. For the Moore and Stillinger families, however, the unsolved status was not fascinating, it was heartbreaking. They lived and died without knowing the truth. And for the town of Villisca, the shadow never lifted. The crime was not just an event in history. It was a wound that time never fully healed. As decades passed and the case remained unsolved, the Villisca Axe Murder House took on a second life, one not tied to courtrooms or police files, but to whispers, ghost stories, and an enduring reputation for the paranormal. When 8 lives are lost so suddenly and without resolution, many people believe that something of that tragedy lingers. For the town of Villisca, the little white house became more than just the site of an unsolved crime. It became known as one of the most haunted places in America. For years after the murders, locals avoided the house at night. Children dared each other to walk past it, while adults spoke in hushed tones about strange sounds and uneasy feelings. Some claimed that lights flickered when no one was home. Others swore they saw shadows moving behind the curtains, even when the house stood empty. These stories spread, and as time went on, the legend of the murder house grew. By the late 20th century, the house had gained national attention not just from true crime enthusiasts but also from paranormal investigators. Ghost hunters, television crews, and authors began flocking to Villisca, eager to capture evidence of what they believed were lingering spirits. Some reported hearing the laughter of children echoing in empty rooms. Others claimed to hear footsteps in the hallways, or whispers carried through the night air. Visitors staying overnight often described a heavy, oppressive feeling inside the house, especially near the upstairs bedrooms where the Moore children once slept. Some left in the middle of the night, unable to shake the sensation of being watched. Others reported objects moving on their own, doors creaking open without explanation, and sudden drops in temperature. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the sheer number of accounts made the Villisca house an irresistible sight for those fascinated by the supernatural. The reputation only grew as television shows like Ghost Adventures and Most Terrifying Places in America featured the house. Each episode added to the legend, portraying Villisca not only as a cold case but also as a place where the boundary between past and present, life and death, felt unusually thin. Of course, skeptics argue that much of this can be explained by psychology. A house with such a dark history naturally invites fear. When people enter expecting to feel something strange, their minds may create the very experiences they anticipate. But even skeptics acknowledge that there is something unsettling about standing in the rooms where 8 lives ended in silence. Today, the Villisca Axe Murder House is preserved as both a historical site and a paranormal attraction. Visitors can take daytime tours, hearing about the history and the tragedy. For the bravest, overnight stays are offered, giving guests the chance to experience the atmosphere firsthand. Whether people come for history or for hauntings, they leave with a story they will never forget. In this way, the house continues to hold power not just as a reminder of a crime unsolved, but as a place where the past refuses to rest quietly. For some, it is a haunted home. For others, it is a monument to unanswered questions. But for everyone, it is a place where history and mystery meet. As time went on and official investigations faded, the Villisca Axe murders moved out of police files and into the hands of researchers, writers, and amateur detectives. With the benefit of hindsight, some began to ask a chilling question: what if the Villisca tragedy was not an isolated crime at all? What if it was part of something much larger, an unseen pattern stretching across America? One of the most talked about modern theories comes from the book The Man from the Train, written by baseball statistician Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James. In their research, the authors argued that the Villisca murders might be connected to a string of eerily similar crimes committed in small towns across the United States in the early 1900s. The Jameses noticed that between 1898 and 1912, there were dozens of unsolved family murders involving an axe. The details were often strikingly alike: entire households killed at night, blinds or curtains drawn, lamps covered or extinguished, and the murder weapon often left at the scene. Many of the cases occurred in rural towns located near railroad lines, suggesting that the killer may have used trains to move quickly from place to place. In their analysis, the Villisca case fit this pattern perfectly. The Moores and the Stillinger sisters were killed in their beds, the house was methodically arranged, and the axe was left behind. Even the odd detail of the slab of bacon left in the kitchen seemed consistent with other crimes, where small, unexplained touches were found. The Jameses pointed to a man named Paul Mueller, a German immigrant and suspected serial killer who had been linked to the murder of a family in Massachusetts in 1897. After that crime, Mueller seemed to vanish from the records, but the Jameses argued that he may have continued to kill across the country, targeting families along rail lines. They believe that Mueller could have been responsible for dozens of axe murders, with Villisca as one of his most notorious crimes. This theory is compelling because it helps explain why no one in Villisca was ever conclusively tied to the murders. If the killer was a transient figure moving between states, then local suspects like Reverend Kelly or Frank Jones may never have been the true culprits. Instead, the murders might have been the work of a stranger who passed through, committed the crime with chilling efficiency, and then disappeared on the next train out of town. Of course, critics of this theory point out that while the similarities are intriguing, there is no direct evidence linking Mueller or anyone else to Villisca. Without physical proof, it remains speculation. Still, the man from the train has given new life to the case, reminding us that history can sometimes hide larger stories beneath the surface. Whether or not Mueller was the man from the train, the theory highlights how vulnerable small towns were in an era when communication was slow, law enforcement was local, and railroads connected even the quietest communities to the wider world. In Villisca, the result was a tragedy that seemed both deeply personal and terrifyingly anonymous. More than a century later, these new theories keep the conversation alive. They do not bring closure, but they offer a possible framework for understanding the crime not as a single isolated act, but as part of a darker chapter in American history. More than a century after the murders, the little white house in Villisca remains standing. Time has changed the world around it, but the house itself continues to draw attention first from neighbors, then from journalists, and eventually from tourists from all over the world. The Moore residence is no longer just a crime scene frozen in history. It has become a carefully preserved site that sits at the intersection of true crime, heritage, and paranormal curiosity. For many years, the house was privately owned and operated as a historical attraction. Visitors could walk through the rooms, guided by stories of the Moore family, the Stillinger sisters, and the unanswered questions of 1912. The goal was not only to preserve the memory of the victims but also to give people a tangible connection to one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. Some came to learn about history. Others came hoping to feel the atmosphere of a place many believed to be haunted. Either way, the house became a steady presence on the map of dark tourism in the United States. In 2023, a major change occurred when U.S. Ghost Adventures, a company known for operating tours of historic and allegedly haunted sites, purchased the Villisca Axe Murder House. This transfer of ownership made headlines across Iowa and beyond. The company announced that it would continue offering guided tours, audio-enhanced experiences, and even expanded cemetery visits to connect the story of the victims with the broader history of Villisca. One of the company's stated goals was to balance respect for the tragedy with the strong public interest in the paranormal. While some tours focus strictly on historical facts, others lean into ghost stories, personal experiences of visitors, and unexplained phenomena reported inside the house. This dual approach reflects the reality of Villisca today. It is both a place of mourning and a place of fascination. The preservation of the house has not been without controversy. Some locals worry that the focus on hauntings overshadows the human loss that occurred there. Others argue that keeping the story alive, whether through history or paranormal tourism, ensures that the victims are never forgotten. For better or worse, the house is now one of Iowa's most visited historical landmarks, drawing curious travelers who might never otherwise have heard of Villisca. Financially, the tours and overnight stays help sustain the upkeep of the property. Visitors who choose to spend the night are often motivated by a mix of bravery and curiosity. Many leave with personal stories of strange noises, restless sleep, or feelings they cannot explain. Whether these experiences are supernatural or psychological, they reinforce the house's reputation and keep it relevant in the modern era. The shift in ownership in 2023 shows that the Villisca Axe Murder House is not fading into obscurity. Instead, it continues to adapt, finding new ways to engage with the public while preserving the chilling legacy of 1912. More than just an old house, it stands as a reminder that some stories never fully end. They live on through the places, the memories, and the unanswered questions that surround them. Today, more than 110 years after the Villisca Axe murders, the case remains one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Theories have come and gone, suspects have risen and fallen, but the truth continues to lie just beyond reach. What remains is a story that refuses to fade, a story that lives in the echoes of history, in the walls of the old house, and in the imagination of everyone who hears it. For law enforcement, the case is officially cold. Modern forensic tools such as DNA analysis, which have solved other century-old mysteries, have not been able to help here. The evidence was too compromised from the very beginning. With so many people entering the house on the day the crime was discovered, any trace that might have identified the killer was lost. What investigators in 1912 could not preserve, no one today can recover. That fact alone makes the Villisca murders likely to remain unsolved forever. And yet, the fascination with this case has only grown. Each generation rediscovers the story, drawn in by its eerie combination of horror and mystery. The victims are remembered as symbols of innocence, their lives frozen in time. The suspects are remembered as shadows, some suspicious, some powerful, all unproven. And the house itself, still standing, has become a monument to unanswered questions. The Villisca Axe Murder House now exists at a crossroads of history and legend. To true crime researchers, it represents the limitations of early 20th century investigations. To paranormal enthusiasts, it is a place where the past lingers, whispering through unexplained sounds and sensations. To the town of Villisca, it is both a burden and a strange source of identity. For better or worse, the community is known around the world because of what happened in 1912. What makes the case so enduring is not only its brutality, but also its silence. Unlike other crimes where motives eventually emerge, here there is nothing but speculation. Was it an eccentric preacher, a vengeful businessman, a wandering drifter, or a serial killer passing through on the railroad? Each theory carries fragments of possibility, but none delivers certainty. That void leaves room for endless retelling, each version shaped by the fears and fascinations of the people who revisit it. Standing outside the little White House today, one cannot help but feel the weight of time. More than a century has passed, yet the questions remain exactly the same as they were on the morning of June 10, 1912. Who entered the Moore home that night, why did they do it, and how did they leave without a trace? These questions may never be answered, and perhaps that is why the story continues to hold such power. In the end, the Villisca Axe murders remind us that not all mysteries can be solved, and not all stories end neatly. Some remain open, lingering like unfinished chapters, daring us to imagine what really happened. And so, as the years roll on, the Villisca case remains exactly where it has always been, caught between fact and legend, history and haunting, forever unresolved. And so, we reach the end of tonight's journey into one of America's darkest and most enduring mysteries, the Villisca Axe Murders. More than a century has passed since that summer night in 1912, yet the story still lingers, like a shadow stretching across time. 8 lives lost, a town forever changed, and a question that continues to echo without an answer: who was responsible? Perhaps the most haunting part of this case is not the crime itself, but the silence it left behind. Theories abound, suspects rise and fall, and new research offers intriguing possibilities. Yet the truth remains locked away. Some mysteries simply refuse to give up their secrets, and Villisca is one of them. But even in the face of uncertainty, one thing is clear: the memory of Josiah, Sarah, their children, and the Stillinger sisters continues to live on. Through history, through storytelling, and through the very walls of that small white house, their lives are remembered. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of a crime that has fascinated investigators, historians, and storytellers for over 110 years. If tonight's story left you with questions, theories, or thoughts of your own, share them in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective. Until next time, remember, behind every mystery is a human story, and sometimes the darkest chapters are the ones that remain unfinished. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and as always, thank you for watching.